Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the British Council signature event. I'm Jean September, the Deputy Director, South Africa of the British Council. I live and work in Cape Town, and it is a real honor to be in Liverpool. Cape Town is also a port city, and I think its people here and in the southern tip of Africa share a similar history. We can talk about that later on. I'll be chairing this session entitled, Is English Language Teaching Inclusive? Do we practice what we preach? I'm hoping, and you can be the judge of this, whether our presentation today, as well as the people who are going to be presenting, you may see that diversity and inclusion. I'm joined today by a team of specialists in the field of inclusion and inclusive education. We certainly look forward to their thoughts and insights, yours in the audience and those who are online. So please save your questions and any comments for the last 10 or 15 minutes of our session today. This year's signature event is linked to the hot off the press publication, Teaching English book, Creating an Inclusive School Environment. The publication will be formally launched tomorrow in 11B at 4:45. And today we have Ellen Darling, who's the editor of it, and she's going to manage our online community and audience. And she's sitting right in front over here. I'll introduce the speakers when they're about to come up. But by way of introduction, let me make a few opening remarks. 19 years ago, the Diversity Unit was established in the British Council. This unit of two sets and drives the strategic direction of our equality, diversity, and inclusion work, and they are supported by a pool of EDI global leads, as well as facilitators, together with other internal and external groups. Equality, diversity, and inclusion are at the heart of our cultural relations ambitions, and our vision is to be an inclusive organization with an inclusive organizational culture. We adopted a mainstreaming approach where our EDI values and principles are embedded within our behaviors and all that we do and say. With this global approach of mainstreaming, equality, diversity, and inclusion, it is also infused into our programmatic work, and that is in English, in the arts, and English language teaching. I work in a region which is the sub-Saharan African region, and over the past 4 years, together with the global education team, we identified inclusive education as a priority area alongside our core skills for the 21st century. We believe that the inclusion of children and young people in public education systems is an entitlement and a fundamental human right, regardless of their gender, ethnicity, ability, socio-economic background, health, or medical condition. If the inclusion of all children and young people is to be successful and sustainable, then it must be predicated on an approach that is achievable, empowering, and based upon a thorough and sensitive understanding of the current context of the school and education system. The commitment to developing inclusive practice therefore requires a multi-tiered response that addresses policy, practice, and culture at all levels within the education system. So with those few remarks, let me pause there and invite Phil Dexter, who is our Global Teacher Development Advisor and Inclusive Consultant, and also the person who organized the session for us today. So thanks, Phil, for him to introduce a video that has been done. So Phil, over to you.
That's great. Okay, hi everybody. I'm just going to take about a minute and then we'll watch a video. I think just to go on from what Jean said, you know, our approach as well is kind of predicated by kind of 4 elements that I call 1A and 3 E's. And, you know, access, which is really getting young people and everyone into education in the first place, and that's a starting point, but that is by no means enough. What really matters is the nature of the learning experience, and that's engagement, really, yeah. Empowerment, of course, as we know, that it's teachers in the classroom who are the main single element that actually makes a real difference. And so ensuring that teachers have the skills and the understanding to develop an inclusive approach. And that's enablement, actually. And empowerment really is having the right to innovate and try out things, take risks and do things. And that, of course, is very much a kind of, comes down from school leadership and above as well. So I think these are the 4 elements. And we've actually put together a video, which we've done with an organisation called ENET, which is the Education Enabling Network, who are working in this inclusive education space. And we have Ingrid here from ENET, so thank you very much for the video. So we're just going to, it's a short video, and as you watch the video, I'd just like you to think really about these 4 elements and how they're actually present in this video. And then we'll come on to the main item, which is really very much evidence-informed research that we've done that actually Maha is going to talk about. So let's hope the video works.
At the heart of inclusive education is good quality, learner-centred teaching. Inclusive education ensures that children are present in school. It also ensures they participate in a range of activities in school and achieve academically and socially. Inclusive education involves ensuring that children are not just in class, but are interested, interacting and thinking.
Any person who is successful in life, they always will remember the one teacher that motivated them, that believed in them.
In each lesson, you can use a variety of different activities. Plan to use activities that involve looking, listening, talking, touching, and moving. This variety of activities means you can adapt each lesson to suit different children's interests and abilities. During the day, give children opportunities to work together as well as on their own.
Bon, travail de groupe parce que ça Group work means the children will work together to share their ideas to create something good. The group work will also allow the children to accept one another. Because there are disabled children in the group, they can better understand each other. The group work will also allow the weaker children to do better. The group work provides pleasure for the children, and I, to be honest, find pleasure in watching the children develop and achieve something. I've adopted this system which allows each child to develop, to accept the others, to integrate socially speaking, and hence to communicate. So, this really helps the children. The children need to be active and to be their own teacher. Our role is to guide them in their work. They are the main actor in their education.
One of the biggest resources in a school setting are the other children. There's a lot of value in promoting peer learning because children are such a super resource.
It is easier to be inclusive if you understand each child as an individual. What are they good at, and what do they need more help with? You can ask other people to help you understand a child's needs and to give you ideas for how to respond to these needs. You might ask the child's parents or other teachers about their experiences of supporting this child or similar children. Other teachers can provide a lot of advice based on their experiences.
Thanks so much, Ingrid and Phil, for that. If there are any questions, note them down for our session at the end. Okay. It gives me great pleasure to invite Maha Bagshaw, who's an education consultant in the UK, but she's also part of the British Council Advisory Group on Promoting Inclusion. So, Maha, if you want to join us. I don't know if any of you filled out the survey that Maha has put up. It's been an online survey for the past 3 weeks or so. And the response has been amazing from around the world. So she's going to share some of the evidence with you.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure for me to be with you today. I am Maha Bagshaw. As Jean mentioned, I work as an international consultant interested in issues related to equity and inclusion in education. I'm here today to present some of the initial findings into the research that was commissioned by the British Council to explore the extent that English language teaching is inclusive. But before I present some of the findings, I'd like to explain the focus on inclusion. As you may already know, the interest in inclusion is growing globally. There is a number of national and international treaties and conventions asserting the right for all for equitable, quality, and inclusive education. So countries that signed up to those legislations and treaties would need to provide quality education for all their learners, regardless of their differences. There has been improvement. There has been improvement over the last 2 decades in terms of increasing the enrollment rate and reducing the dropout rate among children, but issues persist, mainly in countries of Global South and mainly when it comes to the most marginalized groups such as disabled children, nomads, and refugees. A recent global report for the UNESCO shows that around 60 million children worldwide are not included in education, and nearly 1 million children worldwide, they drop out before the completion of the mandatory stage of education. We know from research that different countries are at different stages of development along the road of inclusion. Exclusion, which refers to children who are out of the educational system, is still prevalent in some contexts. Segregation, which refers to the education of some children who require certain support provision in special institutes or special provision located in mainstream schools, but in segregation from their peers who do not require support provision. And these provisions are still prevalent in some contexts. Integration, which refers to the presence of some children who would require support provision in the same environment as their peers, but without having their needs met. All of this does not mean inclusion. So what inclusion means? According to the UNESCO, inclusion refers to the ongoing and unending process of identifying and removing barriers that may limit the presence, participation, and achievement of all children in the same educational environment. So, with this in mind, I'd like to move on now to present some of the research that I have been working on for the last months. I will be drawing on some of the initial findings using the online survey that was completed by 856 participants from 71 countries from all different continents. And I will be also using some of my professional and personal experience together with findings from the literature. The survey asked participants about 3 main things. The first was the meaning of inclusion, and the second was in relation to the barriers that they face that may hinder inclusion, and the third was in relation to the application they used in support of including older learners. Responses regarding the first question, which is related to the meaning of inclusion, were all coded, and all codes were grouped based on the similarity of their meanings. Themes emerged included the role of teachers, removing barriers and addressing individual needs, participation usually in the classroom, attendance, policy, and services. And I think this chart shows, is it the chart one, right? Okay, so this chart shows the responses, how many of, when they were coded, how many responded to each, how many mentioned inclusion to refer to which themes. Okay, so this chart shows that the role of teachers was mentioned the most by participants. It was mentioned by nearly 18% of the participants, followed by participation, usually in the classroom, was mentioned nearly by 17% of participants. While we can see that removal of barriers and identifying the individual needs was only mentioned by 8.3% of participants, and the readiness of the environment was only mentioned by 4.5% of the participants. This shows that participants consider the role of teachers as drivers for inclusion in their classrooms. And it also shows how educators consider that the participation in the classroom is one way of including all their learners. But having only limited percentage of participants referring to removal of barriers and meeting the individual needs of their students as relevant to the meaning of inclusion shows that educators still look at inclusion based on what they can do and are able to rather than what their children may possibly would need them to do. Here are some quotations from participants, and if we look at those quotations, we can see that some participants referred to inclusion to mean all their learners, and some of them looked at inclusion to refer only for disabled people. Previously, mainly in countries of the Global South, inclusion was associated with disabled people. In this survey, we can see that nearly 70% of participants, the vast majority of them were from countries of the Global South, but now they refer to inclusion to mean all their students and not only disabled people. So we can see here there's shift in understanding to what the concept of inclusion means. The second question that participants were asked to respond to was in relation to the hindrance or barriers that face to practice inclusion. We know from the literature that barriers are numerous. Barriers to inclusion are numerous. Some of them can be attitudinal, other institutional, and physical or environmental. These barriers can be universal, but they more affect countries of the Global South, where legislation, equality-related legislation, when available, they are not enforced. Hence, they can manifest in the high level of dropout and low level of enrollment of children in education. Again, all responses related to this question were coded. Codes were grouped under the following themes. Some of them were related to the negative attitudes of parents, peers, educators, limited training, limited human resources, not enough time demand of the educational or school curriculum. This chart shows that the institutional barrier and the school culture was mentioned the most by participants as a barrier to inclusion. If we want to combine the negative attitudes of peers, parents, and educators together, they will constitute 40% of the responses. While diversity of the student was mentioned by nearly 10% of the participants and limited training by nearly 11% of the participants. This will tell us that negative attitudes continue to be a hindrance to inclusion. But we know from literature that positive attitudes on their own are not enough to include all our learners. If the institutes, the structure of the institutes doesn't support inclusion, then inclusion will not work. And we can see here from one of the quotations from the participants talking about the lack of interest from the head teacher. And this tells us if we don't have a strong leadership that's committed to inclusion, then inclusion in the classroom won't work. Also, having 10% of the participants talking about diversity of the students as hindrance to inclusion, this as well will tell us that those teachers are prepared to teach those who are similar, so they can consider the diversity of the students as hindrance to inclusion. A third point that participants were asked to give their views on was related to an action they took in support of including older learners. We know from the research that in so many circumstances, inclusion is the stated aim to achieve, while the practice may reflect more integration. And that means it would be left for the students to manage for themselves with no changes to the organization of the institutes. We know from research and from the video that we just watched that if schools want to include older learners, they need to have inclusion as a stated policy aim of the school. They would need to apply a student-centered approach and interactive teaching methods in their schools. They would need to actively support their students and their teachers. And they would need to consult the views of their learners on the decisions related to their learning. And we also know from research that if inclusion to work, teachers will have to take responsibility of all their learners, and they would need to actively collaborate with one another. And they can do this through different methods, such as mutual observation, coaching, and lesson study. The latter is becoming so popular in countries of the global north after being used for nearly 100 years in countries of the global south. Now, responses regarding this question were again all coded, and codes were grouped under the following themes. We can see that some of the participants have applied some actions that were practical but did not cost them anything. Other adjustments were related to material adjustments, exam adjustments, encouraging participation and interactive teaching methods, learning resources and strategies. This chart shows that encouraging participation and interactive teaching methods, together with material adjustments, were mentioned by the majority of, or were mentioned the most by participants. They were mentioned by 24.8% of the participants. Having teachers recognizing the importance of encouraging participation and the role of interactive teaching methods on including older learners shows that some teachers may have the skills to include older learners, but they may not have the confidence to do so. Having some teachers willing to adjust the material, the course materials, so they make them accessible and available for their students, as well show the willingness of some teachers to make material available for their students. But at the same time, if we don't have the structure of the organization or the schools supporting teachers, those strategies will be applied off the cuff, in the word of some of the participants. And we can see from the responses that issues that needs time, such as learning resources, they were reported by very limited percentage of the participants. And this will take us back to the definition of inclusion, when we found that a limited percentage of the participants reported that inclusion means identifying the needs and meeting the individual needs of their learners. So we can see here the gap in practice and in the understanding of what inclusion means. When participants were asked Participants were also asked to mention the extent that the action they took has worked, and responses shows that over 70% of the participants considered that the action that they took has worked a lot. And this will tell us that some of the actions that teachers applied that were practical, if they have not applied them, they might have excluded some of their learners. At the same time, so many of the actions that they applied did not cost money. So this will show that it's not all the time inclusion equals budget and not enough money. But there's always this comment from teachers about not enough time and not enough support from teachers, from head teachers. And this shows that inclusion is not only about what happens in the classroom. Teachers would need to be supported, and if we don't look as well if we don't as well look at the culture of the school, the organization of the school, the structure of the school, and how they all can be in line with inclusion practice. So we aim to build a whole school approach to inclusion and not only focus on what teacher can do. If we don't do this, then inclusion is not going to work. I think that will take me to the end of what I was intending to present now. This research is still ongoing, and that was the initial findings that I have so far. But for now, I would welcome any question that you may have regarding this survey. Sorry, I need you to slightly speak up because I can't hear you. Okay. Sorry. Uh-huh.
I think we're going to do the questions afterwards.
Okay.
So Jim's about to come up, so I don't know if you want to just tell them that we're going to do the questions after the speakers.
Okay. Okay. So what I will do, because I have some questions that I would like to pose them for you so we can use them at the end of the presentations that my colleagues as well will present. So I will have those questions up, and perhaps at the end of the session when my colleagues finish, then we can take your responses and we give you the microphone so we can hear you. Okay? Is it this one? Yeah. Is it this one? Okay, so I will leave it here. Okay. My pen. Do you have my pen? Okay. Thank you.
We have 3 further short presentations.
Sorry, where?
Just fold it up.
The first one will be by
going to move this along a bit so I can read my notes. Thank you. Right. I've got 5 minutes to give you a definition of inclusion. And when I started thinking about it, I thought, how do I define it? I could define it in one sentence, in less than 30 seconds. I started thinking about actually what exclusion is first. Having experienced exclusion firsthand myself, from the moment I stepped foot on these English shores about, well, a very long time ago. I was 7 years old when my parents moved to this country and I became a minority. I was put into a school, a primary school, and in a junior school. I couldn't speak the language. I could barely speak my own language, read and write in my own language. And all around me were people of a different colour, people who spoke differently, people who ate different food, dressed differently, and I was completely excluded from that. The teachers didn't make any effort in trying to include at that stage. And that experience led me to become mute for 2 years. I actually didn't speak. That was the impact of that exclusion on me. For 2 years, I didn't speak to anybody. And then I was held back throughout my schooling because of that. So they equated not knowing the language and not gaining the help from them to intelligence. Okay. Interesting. Later, I would experience exclusion based on my colour, based on my gender. And then years later, when I went back to my own home country, my birth country, I would experience exclusion on the basis of not being able to speak my own mother tongue properly. So it sort of came back round. It was quite interesting. So what is inclusion? Well, in its most basic form, it's a state of being included. I've, for several years now, been talking about inclusion at various events. I do training on it, and my own definition of it now has evolved to become something else. Initially, I started off thinking of it in its very simple form, but it no longer is that. There's a lot more to it. It's a universal human right to be included. So, in the most basic form, yes, it's inclusion, but it's a sense of belonging. It's the sense of feeling respected, being valued for who you are, feeling a level of support and energy and commitment from others so that you can do your best. Now, those aren't my words. Those are Miller and Katz, 2002. And that really resonates with me, a sense of belonging. It's also about valuing individuals and giving them equal access and opportunities and taking down barriers. So when we think about inclusion, we don't just talk about children. We don't talk about children with special educational needs. We don't talk about just teachers. We should be talking about everybody. So when we look at the findings of Maha's research, where a lot of people complained that the head teachers were unsupporting or unsupportive, perhaps the head teachers don't know how to support. And that's where we need to be finding out a little bit more about how we can support them to become more supportive, right? And I do think it's quite interesting just sitting here today in the front row, listening to Maha speak about the findings, the number of people from the audience who have left. And inclusion has that impact on people. Because when you tell people you're going to be talking about inclusion, what they will say to you is, it doesn't affect me. It's not something that I deal with. But as teachers, as educators, as who we are, it affects all of us and who we are and what we do. Not just children, but from head teachers right down to the cleaners at your school. The people who serve you tea every day. They need all to be included. That's pure inclusion. So, I suppose my definition of inclusion now has moved from that, as I said, that very basic idea of children and disabilities to a much more global issue, a more global idea of it, and giving everybody the right to not just education, but a right to be who they are and what they want to be, wherever they are. And that's it.
Thanks, Verinda. And I do apologize to the communities and the people who are online that I didn't speak into the mic when I introduced the three. We now have David Crabtree. Here we go.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay. I've been set a couple of questions. One was really, what have I been doing to around inclusion and how do I know it works, or something to that effect. And I'm just going to take three little vignettes around that. The book that's going to be launched tomorrow, I've got a chapter in there, and it's my area of interest, which is on what I call the theatre of the classroom. So my vignettes are going to be around this thing called the theatre of the classroom, where we enact education, where it's created. The first one of those is just to try and locate what we might mean by the theatre of the classroom, and what we might mean in terms of inclusion. The physical location of that, the place where it actually happens. One of the things that sort of came to me, particularly in this last presentation, was a child that I was working with that suffered from a stutter. And so obviously, when they went to school, it was decided that we need to try and create something that would enable that child to settle in easily and not be separated and identified and maybe made a little bit of a fool of in terms of the school. And so the teacher in the classroom was obviously going to be very protective with this child and not have them sort of speaking out or reading, at least until they could develop confidence or create a way of doing that within the class, which is fine until the child moves to another class where the teacher hasn't been told, or to another learning situation where people don't know. Okay, so I use that little situation just to say, when we're talking about the theatre of the classroom, when we're talking about enacting inclusion, and when I work with teachers, I do tend to get quite a few teachers who will turn around and say, yeah, well, I do that. But do we do it in the schools in which we work? Do we create that sort of environment across the whole of the theatre of the classroom? Okay. The second situation, the second vignette I'm going to talk about is I've recently been working with some teachers in Mumbai. I've been very fortunate to work with teachers there. And we were looking at their practice, and I did some work with them on multi-sensory teaching and learning, on working with peer groups, on reacting to different ways with which teachers learn, and so on and so forth. And what we did in terms of that training was, they had the sort of classic input from me in terms of the, I did all the sort of background and I showed them some examples, etc., etc. But I also had the opportunity to go back and see them 2 months later putting that into practice across the school. So obviously there were some really positive changes in terms of their teaching. Personally, I was very pleased in terms of what the teachers had done. But the second part of this question I've been set is, well, how do you measure the impact Well, what were we actually looking for? Well, I obviously was looking at the teachers to see what they were doing in terms of their changes in their teaching and their methodology and all the rest of it. But the impact had to be with the learners. Where we're looking in terms of how things are working are in terms of how our learners are learning more successfully in rates of achievement, rates of success, our engagement, and all of those sorts of things. So that's where we look to see whether inclusion is taking place. And also, in terms of access into the classroom, are children who previously were not in the classroom, are they now in the classroom? And for me, that's children who we often give all sorts of titles to, but I call the children who learn differently. Are those children who learn differently now engaged and in the classroom and participating and learning? Okay, so that's my sort of second vignette, the theatre of the classroom and methodology and how we might measure impact. And the third one that I wanted to look at is some work that I do at the University of Westminster, where I work with students. And the programme is looking at access into teaching. And the way that sort of plays into inclusion is that the students that I work with and the students at the University of Westminster, by and large, are first-generation higher education students, members of their family who've not previously been in higher education. By and large, that's what happens across the student population there. Some of those students want to go into education, but now to go into education in the UK, to do the training programme, you have to have done substantial amounts of teaching or voluntary work already in schools before you can go in. And for children of first generation graduates, they don't have the network. They don't know teachers or schools except the school that they worked in. And that's not always the best school to go into to get some sort of preparation for applying for postgraduate certificate in education. So what we do at the University of Westminster is we have developed the networks, we train the students, they go into the schools. But how that plays into inclusion is it provides a whole group of students going into teaching who have not themselves, in terms of their own cultural backgrounds, their own ethnic backgrounds, that they're not widely represented in terms of the teaching population. And so that starts changing the face of the teachers in classrooms in the schools in London, and we've been doing that over the last 10 years. And we're very pleased, I'm very pleased to report that Ofsted has reported that some of the raising of standards in London schools, part of that has been projects such as this, of bringing into classrooms and into teaching teachers who are more representative of the local and the community population. So a question I've got about inclusion is, how much do your schools represent the community, not just in terms of the children that are there, but the teachers that are working in the school and the perspectives that they bring into teaching as well. And in the ways that we can measure success in that, we're not measuring it, the way we measure that success are things like the Ofsted report, are things like the fact that our students aim to do better because they are engaged in terms of the prospects of going into teaching, and the students in the schools that they work with also are more fully engaged and achieve at a high level because they're working with people who relate very closely to them. So those are my three vignettes, and that's my situation. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Fiona, if you can come up.
Hello, everybody. So I'm going to talk very briefly about some of the challenges to inclusion. And I've got 3 words. 3 seems to be the number. So I've got 3 words and 3 stories that I've personally experienced. So the 3 words are fear and judgment, and those are really connected. And the third word is lack of self-awareness. And I'd like to tell you about an experience I had, quite a few years ago now, when I worked in Italy, and I was asked to work with, I was asked to teach English to young people with special needs, because they were hopefully going out to get a job. And I was told that they had mild disabilities. And when I walked into the centre, I saw lots of kids with wheelchairs. There were lots of Down syndrome kids. There were kids that sort of making strange noises. And I thought, well, they can't be them. Thank God I'm not teaching them. And then I realised these were the children I was going to go in and teach English to. And I was absolutely terrified. And it ended up being the best job I've ever had in terms of fun. When I worked there for 3 years, and every single day I came back laughing and smiling. I had so much fun with these kids. And it was pure, fear. Of course I couldn't be afraid of these children. And when I got to know them, they were so unthreatening. And the environment was so lovely. The people I worked with, all the social workers, were so fantastic. And yet, again, when after I'd left, and I was on a cruise around Loch Lomond, and there was a trip of again, young people with special needs, and I looked at these kids, and I was like, for a moment, I thought, how on earth could I have worked in that environment? Because I'd sort of come out of it. And, it's fear of the unknown, and fear of we just somehow, when we're not involved in the other, we have so many judgments about it. And then I went to work in Jordan, and I was teacher training. These were teachers who were working, so Jordanian teachers who had Syrian students in their classes, and we were doing teacher training with them. And it was right at the beginning when we started Language for Resilience and Inclusion. It was coming into the sort of awareness of the British Council. And the Jordanian teachers were surprisingly prejudiced against the Syrian refugees. And this is very strange because the border between Syria and Jordan is completely artificial. And before the war, Jordanians and Syrians went into each other's countries for lunch. It was just, and their families were divided by the border, but they could just cross the border, cross through the fields and go visit their families. So it's very, very strange, this prejudice that some of the teachers, the Jordanian teachers, thought that the Syrians were going to be really difficult to teach, and in some way they had sort of inferior intelligence. And I saw the worst lesson I've ever seen in my life. A Jordanian teacher, very, very young, she was absolutely terrified, and the venom with which she looked at these the Syrian kids, it was a primary, was just horrendous. The children were absolutely terrified. They were quaking in their seats. They couldn't answer. And of course, this opened up a huge discussion in our training about engaging, about using children's names, smiling at children, getting to know them, and all this kind of thing. So much happens because as teachers we're lacking confidence in ourselves. We're worried about who we're engaging with. And then, self-awareness. I observed another Jordanian teacher who was actually very good, and she was doing a lesson in a secondary school, and it was about festivals and celebration, and it was about how we celebrate the birth of a child in our country. And I was sitting at the back and near a group of Syrian girls, and the Jordanian teacher was focusing on the Jordanian girls who were giving lots of feedback and lots of ideas of how they celebrate in Jordan. And she wasn't listening to the Syrian girls who were dying to speak. They got loads of ideas. And when I gave her feedback at the end, I said, well, but why didn't you speak to the back of the class? And she was mortified because she had a blind spot. She just hadn't noticed. And I was also aware of this as my own career as a teacher, that we often have, there's that sort of woolly area. So we notice the good students and we notice the troublemakers, or whatever they are, the guys who've got very good strategies for getting themselves noticed. And then there's this kind of blob in the middle. And I always have this sort of checklist in my head. Who have I not looked at? Who have I not addressed during the hour or whatever it is? And it was kind of consolidated. My son, who hated maths, and I went to see the maths teacher. And the maths teacher had no idea who he was after 3 years. And then eventually, oh yeah, that tall guy that sits at the back. And I was like, well, why don't you put him in the front? And he's big and scary and, oh, we don't want, these were the secondary, they were sort of 17, 18-year-olds. And this is, it's because children are really good at making themselves invisible if they think that being seen is going to challenge them or they're going to get into trouble, they haven't done their homework. So I think really, when I was sort of thinking about one of these challenges, it's just opening our eyes to what is out there and what does it really mean. It's just people wanting to be included and wanting to be part of our group, whatever that is. Thank you very much.
Colleagues, please join me in thanking all our 4 speakers. Okay, now we come to the time where you get a chance to make comments, ask questions. We have about 15 minutes left. So we'll divide the time between our online communities and also in the room here. We had one question earlier on already, and we had another one over there, 3, 4, 5. Okay, all right. And then we'll take a round from our online colleagues. Who's got the mic?
Okay.
Oh.
Okay, well, my name is Liliana Casar. I'm from Cuba, and I would like to ask you 2 questions. May I? Is that okay? Listen. Well, have you thought of including technology in teaching people with special educational needs? Is one of the questions. And sometimes people talk about education, inclusion for people and refer to people with special educational needs for disabled people, but how about talented people? There are some definitions which include people who are above, not below, but above average, and that are also considered as the special needs, right?
Okay.
Do you share?
All right, thank you. Shall we take 2 or 3 questions? Then I'll go back to the panel members. The lady over here. What happened to our other mic?
Yeah, hi, I'm Andrea from the Netherlands, and my question is, how can we include the school leaders in inclusion? In the classroom, I have many ideas, but to involve them as well, because indeed, I don't think they know how to.
Okay. We'll take one more. Here, over here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I just want to make a quick comment from a language teaching perspective and the issue that English actually enjoys hegemony over other languages. The comment that I would like to make is that from research there has been indication of findings that there has to be investment into mother tongue instruction and extending it, especially beyond the elementary school level. So these are some of the considerations that we could keep in mind as different countries and education systems to make sure that we include all learners and embrace diversity in the process. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, Maha.
Can I go on again? Okay. The first speaker, whose name I forgot, I'm afraid, talked about A and 3 E's around inclusion. Can I add an R for representation? Maha talked about integration and inclusion. My feeling is that if you're a disabled person and you don't see representation of yourself in course books and materials, that you're being integrated but not included. Especially perhaps with reference to the book that is being published tomorrow, where are LGBT people in TEFL course books? Surely the British Council has an enormous buying power. When will the British Council insist that publishers don't exclude LGBT people from their materials?
Okay, thanks. And one last question. Over here.
Hi, my name is Matanzi Mamweli from South Africa. I'm extremely impressed with the presentations shared with us today. I want to encourage everyone to continue this. My view is that you need to grow even further a community of activists around inclusion. And I would like to add that inclusion, as explained this morning, should not only be confined to education. It must be presented in the broadest sense, and a useful approach, I fully agree. It's a human right approach, it's the approach taken by UNESCO and all others. So that's my comment on that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Any of our speakers want to take the first few questions? There was one on technology, use of technology. There was one on the school leaders. You need to come to the mic.
Thank you. Questions are very broad, so I'm just going to take a couple of points from the questions, really, and then leave it open for the other people to respond. I'm going to look at the sort of technology question, the SEN and then the gifted and talented, and the school leaders. I think I'll have a go at those three in one. I think one of the things I think we all have to accept is if we're going to include something in terms of our education, we have to include technology. The children that we are working with are moving into a world which we can't even possibly imagine. So obviously technology has to be integral, and I don't think it's a case of technology to answer a particular question. I think we have to integrate technology into what we're doing, and we have to integrate all the ideas of technology into what we're doing, including all the new forms of knowledge and the new ways in which we're thinking, particularly as we move into a world in which artificial intelligence is making huge inroads into the knowledge-based economies that we were all hoping that our children were going to be employed into. So technology is fundamentally important, and it should be integrated in absolutely everything that we're doing in every situation. And I think that's a massive a challenge for us as teachers, because we've all come into this hyper-technology world at very different stages. I was quite impressed when I saw the young technicians putting together the computer so it could work in all the ways it needed to do today, and I was thinking, I could not do this, but do they know about the internal combustion engine? Anyway. All right, and in terms then of the particular question about SEN and disabled children, and also including children who are increasingly very able indeed, I think what we're saying when we're talking about inclusive education is just a recognition that every child in our class is different. And that therefore means that we tend not to take a response that classifies children into groups, but just recognise the fantastic range which is there. So I think one of the things I forgot to say in terms of the work that I do is that what we have found, and I'm sure it's the same for everybody who works in this area, that when you work in an inclusive way, it's not just those children who might have been at the margins, whichever that margin is, who now are performing better, but actually the whole class or the whole school performs better. And the reason that I'm so enthusiastic about inclusive education is because actually it solves your problems as teachers and raises standards and levels in education and engagement right across the system. So yes, it needs to include children who are most able in the same way it needs to include all children. And then if I can then lead on from that into why managers are so important, if schools are going to integrate technology into what they're doing and the world as it is today, as opposed to some world that existed 200 years ago when people were, copying words and writing letters and all these things to each other. If we deal with the modern world, and we deal with the modern world in which every child in our class is different, and we have that coordination right across the school so everybody is working as one with all of the children, that involves leadership. And that involves leaders basically managing learning within the school. And I think the role that we haven't started giving school leaders is that they are managers of learning and learning achievement in the school, and that's where we need to take things further. So thank you very much indeed.
Oh, I could speak from there. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. That's fine. Okay. So, there was a question about the role of head teachers and how head teachers can be supported so they can make their schools inclusive. Is that right? Yeah. So I think, yes, inclusion is not only what happens in the classroom. We need to be working and aiming to build a whole school approach to inclusion. And here, the role of the head teacher is very important. And that's, we can see from so many experience in different countries that the role of teacher in some places are more administrative rather than educational. So when the role of the head teachers will change to become a role of a head teacher that's believe in inclusion and support inclusion in the school in terms of monitoring how inclusion is working, in terms of assessing the needs of the staff or of the students, in terms of working together with the staff to improve existing practices so it becomes more inclusive. I think that's when we start to be working together as a staff in the school, teachers and leadership in the school towards inclusion. So it's not only teachers and not only head teacher. But at the same time, we need to be thinking as well from above. It's not only head teacher. As my colleague said, Fiona, I think, that head teachers would also need to be supported. And here, when we start to think of higher education, what they are doing, are they really graduating teachers who are ready to teach inclusively? Are they really working towards building more capacities in this regard? Do we have courses in higher education that talks about inclusion? So we still can see in some contexts these are not available, and when available they might not attract a lot of people. And that's because if we don't as well work towards having a policy that have inclusion central to it, it's difficult as well to put the effort only on one school or on just like head teachers or one category group of the population in the school. So that's in relation to the head teachers. I have very short memory. I really forgot the rest of the questions. But
it's okay. It's all right. We're running out of time.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I was going to ask Phil. Phil, you've got 1 minute slot. It was around sort of course books for some of the, yeah, and also for LGBT.
Yes, we do have our, we have our online modules for actually special educational needs, and we have actually face-to-face training. And these are very popular, actually. I mean, I think the key point is that yes, you know, if we want to explore our learners' learning needs and how that relates to special educational needs, whether that's learners who may be in the autism spectrum, dyslexia, or social emotional learning needs, etc. I mean, the more teachers understand that, the better armed they are. But I think it's also, as has been said, really, it's very much about it's good practice in terms of focus on teaching and learning. So it's a much broader concept. Yeah. Can I just add one? So we have courses, but I think it's much more than that, you know, in terms of, and it has been said again, the answers lie in our schools, in finding solutions in context. Yeah. I just want to make one little remark about the representation, which I agree with absolutely. You know, and I think there has been discussion and progress being made in terms of course books, but a lot more needs to be done. But I think the central point is that learners do have to feel that the materials they're using represent them. You know, and I think it's about resources, but it's about also what teachers and schools do as well in order to actually change that.
Yeah. Just maybe to add to that as well, there are 3 current sort of guidebooks, and the one is on race equality, there's one on promoting inclusion, and there's a third one on... No, it's not diversity. What's the third one on? Oh, religion and beliefs. And with the 6 areas of diversity that we work on in the British Council, LGBT and sexual orientation is one of them. So over the next sort of year or so, we will have one guide for each of those, and I think those will be useful resources. The 3 that we've done so far have been the sort of priority areas, particularly the one around race equality. So watch the space. If I can ask Ellen.
Yeah, is this working? Yeah?
No? Do you want to come up here or so people can see you? Okay.
Yeah, just to say, in the spirit of inclusion of those people watching from home, there have been lots of very positive comments about the interventions, particularly Varinda's, about being excluded and how inclusion is really for everybody. And that seemed to be a great insight for Ezra Sagol, Manjusha Sangrikola. They were very positive about that intervention, and Catherine Wilson also wanted to say that she felt that initial teacher training needs more input in terms of SEN in order to prepare teachers before they go out into the world and into classrooms so that they can deal better and use more inclusive practices. And then Patty from Peru says that she found it interesting to realise that problems are actually global, and considering that she's in a developing country, she says she could have thought that it was more related to local legislation and culture or idiosyncrasies. So that was a revelation to her to see that it is a more of a global thing. And she also, her and Sadika Ghazel from India, wanted to also point out that exclusion can be experienced as a teacher too, especially if you're in a minority in any sense, and wanted to say how can we sensitise the teachers who are from socially or culturally dominant communities to be aware of inclusion with respect to students and their colleagues too. And I thought that was an interesting point to make, that, you know, the more teachers we have from minority groups, then that will also have a positive effect on the classroom dynamics.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Ellen, for that, and colleagues who contributed to the online discussion. Thank you. We've come to the end of our session this morning, and I think we should all go away sort of thinking about inclusion as a journey. And the fact that all of you have stayed till the end, it means that you're somewhere on the continuum on that journey. And I'd like to leave you with two sort of mantras that we've used in South Africa when we work with teachers on inclusive pedagogy. The one is all children and they all matter equally. And the second one is all good teachers can teach inclusively. And I must say, with one or two of the workshops that we've done so far, we've, in a sense, started their journey in changing their mindset and attitudes and behaviors in terms of how they see their students and how they need to include all of them in their classroom. I'd like to thank all of you for participating and listening today, and let's keep on the road to an inclusive education society. Thank you.